Steve Miller was 18 when he walked out of the county foster home carrying everything he owned in a worn backpack. Inside were 2 t-shirts, a pair of jeans, and a strange letter that didn't make much sense. The letter had come from a law firm in downtown Seattle. It stated that he was required to attend the reading of a will belonging to Nathaniel Vance, a billionaire real estate developer whose name was stamped on half the skyscrapers in the city. Steve had never met him. As far as he knew, he didn't even have family left. Still, the letter included a bus ticket and the address of an office on the 42nd floor of a sleek glass tower overlooking Elliott Bay. Curiosity alone was enough to get him there. The office looked like something out of a movie. Polished marble floors reflected soft light. Assistants moved quietly through the halls in tailored suits. Massive windows stretched from floor to ceiling, showing the gray skyline of Seattle. Steve suddenly became very aware of the scuffed sneakers on his feet. Inside the conference room sat several sharply dressed strangers. At the head of the table was a tall man with silver hair and a confident smile. Richard Vance. Steve didn't need an introduction to guess who he was. The man carried the relaxed arrogance of someone who had never worried about money for a single day in his life. At the far end of the room stood a lawyer with a calm but cold expression, dressed in a charcoal suit. Marcus Thorne, he introduced himself, executor of Nathaniel Vance's estate. The reading of the will began. Marcus listed properties, corporate shares, private investments, and massive financial accounts. One by one, the assets were transferred to Richard Vance. Richard leaned back in his chair, clearly enjoying the moment. Then Marcus paused. His eyes shifted toward Steve. "And to Stephen Miller," he said evenly, sliding a small envelope across the table, "Mr. Vance leaves $1. For a moment, the room went silent. Then someone chuckled. Richard laughed openly. Steve opened the envelope slowly. Inside was a single dollar bill, old, creased, and ordinary. It looked like the kind of dollar someone might receive as change at a gas station. Heat burned in his chest. Humiliation. But Steve didn't say a word. Instead, he folded the bill carefully, slipped it into his jacket pocket, and stood up. "Thank you for your time," he said quietly. Cold Seattle rain was falling when he stepped outside the tower. Cars rushed past on the wet street, headlights glowing through the gray afternoon. Steve pulled his thin jacket tighter and began walking away from the building. Behind him, 42 floors above the city, a massive fortune had just been handed out. And somehow he had walked away with $1. The next morning, Seattle woke beneath gray clouds and steady drizzle. Inside a cramped studio apartment above a laundromat in South Seattle, Steve sat at a small kitchen table with a paper bag from a convenience store. Inside the bag was a single loaf of cheap white bread. Across him sat Sammy, a skinny 10-year-old with messy brown hair and wide eyes. Sammy had been Steve's closest friend back at the foster home, more like a little brother than anything else. Steve tore the bread in half and slid the larger piece across the table. "Eat," he said. "You've got school." Sammy frowned. "You should take it," he said. "You're the one who had the big meeting yesterday." Steve shrugged. "Trust me," he said. "It wasn't that big." He didn't mention the dollar bill still folded inside his jacket pocket. Just as Sammy reached for the bread, headlights flashed through the apartment window. A black SUV rolled slowly to a stop outside. Moments later, there was a knock on the door. Steve opened it and froze. Standing in the hallway was Marcus Thorne, the same lawyer from the day before, still wearing the same calm, unreadable expression. "Good morning, Mr. Miller," Marcus said politely. "May I come in?" Steve stepped aside, confused. Marcus entered the tiny apartment, glancing briefly at the peeling paint, the rattling heater, and the second-hand furniture, before turning his attention back to Steve. "I believe we need to talk about that dollar," he said. Steve crossed his arms. "If you came here to explain the joke, I already got the message." Marcus shook his head slightly. It wasn't a joke. From inside his coat, he removed a small folder and placed it on the kitchen table. "Your grandfather," Marcus said carefully, "was a very strategic man." Steve blinked. "Grandfather?" "Yes," Marcus replied calmly. "Nathaniel Vance was your grandfather." The words hung in the room. Sammy stopped chewing. Steve stared at him. "Then why did he leave me $1? Marcus opened the folder and slid a document forward. "Because leaving you nothing would have allowed Richard Vance to claim you were accidentally omitted from the will," he explained. "In probate law, that could trigger a legal challenge." He tapped the paper. $1 proves Nathaniel did not forget you." Steve's confusion only deepened. "Then why bring me there at all?" Marcus allowed the faintest hint of smile. "Because that wasn't the only will." From his briefcase, he removed a small metal key and placed it on the table. "This morning," Marcus said, "we're going somewhere your uncle doesn't know exists." An hour later, Steve sat in the back seat of the black SUV as it drove away from Seattle. The city skyline slowly disappeared behind them, while the highway climbed into the forested foothills east of the city. Tall evergreen trees surrounded the road, blocking out most of the gray sky above. Eventually, the highway turned into a narrow road that led to a long private driveway. At the end of it stood a quiet mountain estate, hidden among towering pine trees and fresh snow. Marcus led Steve inside the large house and down a staircase into a quiet underground study. The room felt old and secure, with thick stone walls and a heavy wooden desk. In the center of the room stood a large steel safe. Marcus stepped forward and inserted the small metal key. With a heavy click, the safe door slowly opened. Inside were several sealed envelopes and stacks of documents tied to accounts worth $50 million. Steve felt his breath catch in his throat. But Marcus handed him something else first, a single handwritten letter. It was from Nathaniel Vance. As Steve unfolded the page, he realized something important. The dollar bill had never been the real inheritance. It had only been the beginning. Steve stood quietly in the study, the letter trembling slightly in his hands, while the fire in the stone fireplace crackled softly nearby. He read the first line again. "Steve, if you are reading this, then Marcus has done his job." Steve glanced up at the lawyer. Marcus stood near the wall with his hands calmly folded behind his back, giving him space. Steve looked back at the letter. "Your father was the son I trusted most," it continued. "He had integrity, patience, and the judgment required to lead the empire I built. Richard knew that, and he made sure your father never got the chance." Steve felt a tight weight in his chest. Growing up, he had heard whispers about his father, but never the full story. Now he was beginning to understand. Nathaniel's handwriting became firmer in the next paragraph. "Years ago, Richard manipulated a real estate project in Phoenix. When the deal collapsed, the debt was quietly transferred to your father's name. By the time I discovered the truth, the damage had already been done." Steve slowly lowered the letter for a moment, staring at the floor. The pieces of his past were finally starting to make sense. Nathaniel's message continued. "I spent the rest of my life watching Richard slowly hollow out the company I built. I could not remove him without destroying everything. But you are outside his reach." Steve turned the page. The final instructions were short and direct. "You have 30 days to take control of Vance Holdings. Use the $50 million. Buy debt, buy leverage, buy influence. Do whatever it takes. If you fail, the trust dissolves." Steve lowered the letter slowly. 30 days, he said quietly. "I don't even know how to read half the paperwork inside that safe." Marcus finally stepped forward. "That," he said calmly, "is where I come in." Over the following days, Steve's life began moving faster than he ever thought possible. Every morning started early in the study, while Marcus walked him through stacks of financial reports, contracts, and corporate filings. Steve slowly learned how large companies borrowed money, how debt could control entire corporations, and how investors moved billions of dollars quietly behind closed doors. One evening, Marcus tapped a spreadsheet and explained, "Buying stock attracts attention. Buying debt gives you control." But the lessons didn't stay theoretical for long. Steve soon hired a financial consultant recommended through one of Marcus's contacts. His name was Daniel Reeves, a sharp and confident man who seemed to understand the financial world perfectly. At first, Daniel appeared extremely helpful. He guided Steve through several early purchases of distressed corporate debt connected to Vance Holdings. But Marcus eventually noticed something strange. One of the deals Daniel strongly recommended involved bonds that had already been quietly transferred to a shell company, one connected directly to Richard Vance. Marcus shut the deal down immediately. Steve stared at the documents in disbelief. "You're saying he was working for my uncle?" Marcus nodded calmly. "In this world," he said, "loyalty is often rented." As if the betrayal wasn't enough, Richard soon began pushing back. Within days, several banks suddenly refused to process Steve's financial transactions. A legal complaint appeared accusing an unknown investor of attempting to manipulate Vance Holdings' debt structure. Richard had noticed. Late one night, Steve sat alone in the study staring at Nathaniel's letter again. 30 days. Now there were only 22 left. Marcus poured 2 glasses of whiskey and set one beside him. "Your grandfather didn't choose you because this would be easy," Marcus said. Steve looked up. Marcus met his eyes. "He chose you because Richard has never faced someone who has nothing left to lose." By the time the 4th week arrived, Seattle's winter rain had settled into a steady gray drizzle that seemed to hang over the city day and night. Inside Vance Tower downtown, Richard Vance was hosting one of his famous charity galas. The event filled the entire ballroom on the 39th floor. Crystal chandeliers glowed above polished floors. A live jazz band played softly, while waiters moved through the crowd carrying trays of seafood and champagne. Politicians, investors, and some of the city's most powerful business leaders filled the room. For Richard, it was the perfect stage. He stood near the center of the ballroom with a glass of scotch in his hand, laughing with reporters while cameras flashed around him. The headlines the next morning would paint him exactly the way he liked to be seen: Seattle's most powerful real estate mogul and the generous face of the Vance empire. What Richard didn't know was that the quiet financial pressure building around his company had never stopped. It had simply moved out of sight. Across the city during the previous 3 weeks, Steve and Marcus had worked almost entirely behind closed doors. While Richard fought legal battles in public, Marcus had quietly redirected their strategy. Instead of chasing stock shares that might raise suspicion, Steve began purchasing the company's outstanding debt through several private investment vehicles, piece by piece, loan by loan. By the time Richard realized what was happening, more than half of Vance Holdings' vulnerable debt had already changed hands. And the name behind those transactions had remained invisible until tonight. The ballroom doors opened quietly at first, barely noticeable over the music. But conversations slowly began to fade as people turned their heads. A tall young man stepped inside wearing a dark tailored suit that fit him perfectly. His hair was neatly combed, his posture confident, and his expression calm. Steve Miller walked into the room. For a moment, no one recognized him. Then Richard did. The smile on his face slowly stiffened. Steve walked steadily across the ballroom floor until he reached the table where several board members and major investors were gathered. Marcus stood a few steps behind him, silent as always. Steve placed a slim leather folder on the table and opened it. "I believe several of you will want to see this," he said calmly. Inside were copies of newly transferred debt agreements, millions of dollars in loans that had once belonged to Vance Holdings, loans that now belonged to a private trust, Steve's trust. Uneasy whispers spread around the table. Richard's voice cut sharply through the tension. "You think buying a few scraps of paper makes you important?" he scoffed. Steve didn't raise his voice. "No," he said calmly. "But owning the majority of a company's debt does make me its largest creditor." The words landed like a hammer. Several board members leaned forward, flipping through the documents quickly. Marcus stepped closer and added quietly, "Under corporate restructuring law, creditors holding this level of debt can force an emergency review of executive leadership." Richard's face darkened. But Steve wasn't finished. He slid another set of documents across the table. These weren't loan agreements. They were bank records. Wire transfers, offshore accounts, evidence showing that millions of dollars had quietly been diverted from Vance Holdings into shell companies connected directly to Richard and his wife. The room fell completely silent. Phones slowly appeared as guests began recording. Whispers turned into shocked murmurs. Richard looked around and realized something terrible. The balance of power had shifted. Not in a courtroom, not in a private meeting, but right here in front of everyone. Steve met his uncle's stare across the table. For the first time since the will reading, Richard no longer looked amused. The emergency board meeting took place early morning. The atmosphere inside Vance Tower was nothing like the glamorous gala just days earlier. Executives who had toasted champagne now sat stiffly around the long conference table, their expressions tense. Lawyers filled the room. Financial analysts reviewed documents on glowing screens. Every display showed the same numbers: debt ownership, control percentages, voting power. Steve Miller sat quietly at the far end of the table beside Marcus Thorne. For the first time in his life, Steve was not the outsider in the room. He was the one holding the leverage. The chairman cleared his throat. Based on the financial position presented, the board will now vote on restructuring executive leadership. The vote didn't take long. One by one, hands went up. Richard stared around the room in disbelief. When the final vote was counted, the result was clear. Richard Vance was removed as CEO of Vance Holdings. Federal investigators would soon begin reviewing the financial records Steve had revealed. The empire Richard believed he controlled was no longer his. Richard pushed back his chair violently and pointed across the table. "You think this makes you better than me?" he scoffed. "You just got lucky." The room went silent. Steve slowly reached into his jacket pocket. From inside, he pulled out the same dollar bill from the day of the will reading. He placed it gently on the table in front of Richard. "My inheritance," Steve said calmly. "Don't spend it all in one place." 6 months later, things looked very different. Vance Holdings had stabilized under new leadership. Several internal reforms were underway, and the company had begun funding housing and education programs across the state. But Steve wasn't living like a billionaire. Most afternoons he could be found outside a renovated youth center in Tacoma, where dozens of kids from foster homes now had a safe place to study, play basketball, or simply spend time together. Sammy ran across the grass chasing a golden retriever, laughing like a kid who no longer had to worry about tomorrow. Marcus stood nearby, watching quietly. "Your grandfather would be proud." Steve looked out at the kids playing under the bright afternoon sun. Maybe Marcus was right. Because the greatest victory hadn't been revenge. It had been making sure someone else never had to grow up the way he did. Now, let me ask you something. If you suddenly had the power Steve did, would you choose revenge or would you choose to change lives?